Welcome to another episode of Selling What's Possible. This is the podcast that is created and for enterprise account teams, chief revenue officers, CFOs, CEOs, all those involved in enterprise account growth and retention. And joining me today is Mark Bourgeois from Oratium. Oratium is messaging experts. They're terrific at helping account teams create relevant messaging. And as everybody knows, messaging is one of the most important parts of successful selling, expansion selling, and growth. Mark and I, we've known each other for a while. We work together on joint opportunities surrounding clients that have the problem of trying to be relevant in the moment to make a difference in escalating and enlarging, expanding pipelines and successful selling. So, Mark, welcome to Selling What's Possible. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. And why don't you tell us a little bit about Oratium and what you guys do, just as a way to get started here?
Yeah, definitely. The way we like to describe ourselves is in the solution to a huge problem that sales leaders face, and that's sales conversations that don't actually drive sales. And you might think, well, what do you mean by that? Because my teams are out selling all the time. They're out meeting with customers all the time. But when you stop and think about it, that's one of the hardest environments to master, right? A customer conversation. And so it goes wrong, and it goes wrong a million different ways. We've all been there. We've all been in the meeting that was supposed to be an hour and turned out to be only 15 minutes, or where the main contact doesn't show up, or somebody asks a completely random question that derails your flow, on and on and on. So that's the big problem. It's costing your sales, depending on how well you track it and what business you're in, probably anywhere from 10 to 25% relative to your overall number. It's a huge problem. And it breaks down simply into message failures, so the way it's designed, and then the way it's executed, so the use of that messaging.
That's great. So there's so many, words of wisdom you could share with our audience today on how to get this right. What are some of the sort of approaches and methodologies you sort of take to, I think you talk about radical simplification of the message, right? We all show up with one of the problems that you always talk about is the 50 PowerPoint slide deck. No one can really absorb it. They can't reuse it internally. If the salesperson's not going through it, first of all, it's too big anyway.
Yep.
So it's just overcomplication of messaging, too much messaging about your product yourself. So maybe take us through sort of what you do to, just sort of change, the formula here.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and it's one that I think just about everybody faces. The shorthand for it, as you were just alluding to, is death by PowerPoint. We're getting decked to death. These decks that are crammed with way too much information, far more than you could ever hope to cover, in a meeting that lasts a day. A lot of times we look at some of these decks and you think, well, how many days do you have? And I go, we have an hour. One slide could take up an hour. And so it's just completely overwhelming to the customer. Our brains just aren't built to process information in a meeting environment at that level, not even close, right? So people get overwhelmed and they get lost. And when they get lost, they tune out if they're on a Zoom call, they go play Candy Crush, or if they're in person, they just sort of, grin and bear it and suffer until the end. And the end result is, sort of no sales. So we look to solve that. We look to solve for those problems around those big, unwieldy, very sender-centric decks, and that ultimately we simplify them and we storify them. So what I mean by that is, you mentioned radical simplification. We just boil everything down into its essence. We throw everything that's secondary into an appendix, and that becomes the primary document. That's the discussion document that we want sellers to use. And then we train them in that and coach them in that so that they walk into that room confident because they've already had the experience and they've been coached on it to deal with the types of questions and objections they might have, as well as just use the deck effectively in a conversation. So we do all of that. We take them through message redesign, then the coaching, and then the execution. And we track that so that they can now tie back and say, okay, well, how much did that lift sales, or how much did that drive this or that metric?
And how often do you see the current state being the 50 slide deck going out the door? It's really pretty cemented behavior, I would say. Certainly, we're all guilty of having done it somewhere in our career, right? How common is it today?
I mean, I think it would be easier to ask how common is it that we see short decks in the form of stories. And that's just, like 1,000-year flood. It was just not in my lifetime. The founder of our company, I remember when we often review decks Companies, leaders will send us decks and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I would go through in great detail using our approach, our methodology. And then our founder said something that really simplified things for me. And it was, just start from the premise that it's not going to be good. And I hate to say it in a way, but he was right. It's so rare. It's so rare that you see somebody or a deck or a story that's being told as well as it can be.
Great. Well, that gets me to sort of this whole concept of flipping the script in the first place. As you know, we advocate working backwards from customers, identifying the customer need, focusing on, what issues and problems and urgent matters they have to address, and then trying to build a message that aligns to having that conversation, that discussion that starts to reveal the problem itself and a way to sort of collaborate with the customer on solving that problem, and really becomes entirely not a sales call, but really a collaboration call. Yep. Where you're working together. The dynamic of that is huge potential, don't you think? It's if you change the whole, throw the PowerPoint away, and you simplify this to a discussion guide that works backwards about the customer's problem, you guys have a kind of an architecture of how to even construct that discussion guide and frame it to be very, very powerful. And we know that this works because customers react very positively. In fact, the fact that someone walks in with that kind of approach, they're delighted just to have that happen.
Oh, completely.
Because
we have clients that have won business simply on that basis, simply because they walked in with 3 or 5 slides. And they won the business because they were literally the only ones who were basically respecting the customer's own policy for how much to bring into these types of conversations. Yeah. So even before you get into the content, this can move you down the road towards successful selling. I think that somewhere along the line, I think what happens in sales is we forget that in order to have a solution, you have to have a problem. And once upon a time in your companies, everybody on this listening or watching on this podcast, your solutions were developed as solutions to existing or unmet needs in the marketplace, right? There was a problem that was identified, and then that solution was developed in response to that. And now you're going out, or your teams are going out, and you're selling that solution. Well, here's the problem with the typical approach. It starts by talking about the solution. It starts with, okay, here's what we do. Here's our history. Here we're number one in this space. We're the most admired company, whatever it might be. It always starts, these decks, they always start with what we do, who we are, mission, vision, and values. And the problem with that, I like to describe it as if you were just, as a customer, you're sort of dropped into the third reel of a movie. You're like, well, why should I care about that product or that offering? You're not giving me any reason to sort of understand why that solution is supposed to help me. And so all we're really looking to do in a sales conversation is recreate that journey. Recreate that journey where we meet the customer where they are, which is with some kind of a problem. That could be a goal. It could be any kind of a gap, right? It's sort of a stated gap to where they want to be versus where they are now, right? And there's a lot of different ways you can think about that in terms of problems. But you want to meet them there. And then you want to have a conversation with them about, okay, well, do you realize this problem? Do you have any understanding of how it's affecting you, how much it's affecting you? Okay, great. Now let's talk about our solution. Now let's introduce the solution and how that will solve your problem. And so when you connect those two things together, what you're really doing is building a story. And there's a lot of reasons why that's incredibly powerful and effective in sales conversations, not the least of which is it's far easier to remember and then to retell. When your customer goes to that buying group or goes to that executive team where that decision meeting is made on your solution, it's much easier for them to tell that story that you told them if you tell it in that order.
So this is the fascinating part that I wanted to really get to in this podcast, because the way that you simplify the story, and I guess the 5 slides that you ultimately choose are really a way, it's like supporting story material or evidence that the person who's your primary contact or the hero of the story at the customer, the one that's the sponsor of taking this forward internally, you've pointed out before, which I think is highly relevant, is that they have to tell this story internally without you, the salesperson, to a lot of people. And they have to do it quickly, within minutes, and they have to do it convincingly, and they have to be excited about it, and it's got to resonate with those other people. So you're really crafting a message that can be retold.
That's it.
And that's the secret sauce that is really missing.
That's the ultimate test, right? That's the acid test for how effective a message is. Can it be retold? And so much, nobody gets this. And yet, if you think about it, you know this dynamic. You've experienced this where you thought you had it because you had a great conversation with the person at the customer, the prospect that you met with. And then they called you up and said, nope, you didn't get it. Where sales go to die is in that second meeting that you don't get invited to. And what happens in that meeting when the messaging is not crisp, is not storified, is people look at it and they're like, it's just not compelling. They're like, I don't know, it seems like it has some pretty cool features. I mean, they shared all of this AI stuff in it. That's what we're talking about these days. But I just don't see why we really need to change. I think we're okay. Can you just go back to them and say, hey, Mark, we appreciate the discussion and you're coming, but we're just going to stick with what we have. That's just where sales go to die. You need messaging that is designed for success in that, both the first meeting, right? You got to convince the person you're meeting with, but also in that second meeting.
I think that's such great advice because it's the number one issue is what are you having that discussion about and how is it being told? Yeah. We often hear, right, well, you sound like everybody sounds the same, or I really couldn't, it's kind of interesting because if you're on the selling side, you don't necessarily understand why the buyer has the perspective that they have, but you have to put yourself in their shoes, which is they don't care about your product or capability. What they care about is their problem. And so you've got to be incredibly articulate about that problem and what would be the benefits of solving the problem, the desired outcomes. And you also get into asking them questions, right? Well, what's important to you in solving this problem? Do I really understand this? But that type of discussion flow works really, really well. So it's kind of frustrating that all of us have a hard time replicating that over and over again. What goes into your 5-slide? Could you just sort of lay out like, well, if I'm going to go have that conversation, are there elements?
Yes.
And just the high level elements that you should be
saying. So 5 slides ideal. So these days we're going with 7, but either way, most people look at that and they go,
better than 50.
How can I get my story down to that? And we had one client, said, if they invented 3-point font, we'd find a way to use it. So some people are like, okay, 5 slides, 7 slides. I'm going to put 4 slides on one. No, that's not what we mean at all. They've got to be, it can't be 5 slides, that are really 20. So it really is a story that unfolds across a very small number of slides. And so, like I said, it starts with a problem. And as you mentioned, it's not your problem, it's their problem. And that problem is going to depend on who is responsible, who makes the decision. And so the way you think about that is going to be different depending on who you're meeting with. So if you're meeting with somebody who's got revenue responsibilities, the problem needs to be framed in terms of the gap to their goals. But what happens if there's also somebody who's in operations on the decision-making group or somebody from finance? You have to frame the problem in terms that people know and care about. And that's what makes it, I think, really challenging for a lot of people. Is I like to call it a road game. When we're talking about our solutions, we've had all the technical training. We know that product backwards and forwards. We can talk forever about that. That's comfortable. But when we have to talk about the customer's business, when we have to talk about the people that we're meeting with and the challenges that they face and their gaps, we lose a lot of confidence there. And so as you mentioned, the value of questions and research it's really high here. Even said, starting off with that problem at the beginning, you win a lot of goodwill. If you go and you say, I think this is the kind of problem that we're seeing businesses like yours facing, you're going to win a lot of credibility simply by an attention and engagement, simply by starting by talking about them. They'll respect you for the effort. And by and large, for those of you who call on a fair number of customers, you're going to have a pretty good intuitive idea of at least, let's say, 2 out of 3 of the pain points, which is the next part of that story in the slide run, is just unpacking that problem. And then you go through that, right? And you discuss the problem and their pain points, and you hopefully convince them, yeah, there's a problem I have, and it's a big problem. And then they're just going to have a big question, which is going to be, okay, well, we talked about the problem. Can you solve it? How do you solve it? And that's where then we start to talk about the solution. But the solution now is framed in terms of the problem. So it's not like a spewing features and benefits. Instead, it's describing the solution in ways that's meaningful to the customer. And so that gets you through those sort of 5 to 6 slides. There'll be a few other questions you'll have to answer, and you put those in to the subsequent slides, or maybe objections like, okay, well, that might solve the problem, but what's the ROI on that? What's the payoff? Is this going to cost $1 billion? And they may have a question about implementation, for example. How hard is this to roll out? And so you're going to work through those, and you're going to conclude, this is the last slide, with the action, the next steps. What exactly are you asking the customer to do? Where do you want them to go next? Is it demo, pilot, whatever it might be, but you want to be crystal clear on what you're asking them so they know what they're being asked to do. And that's it. That really boils it down into 5 to 7 slides. And like I said, if there's extra stuff, people always have extra stuff. You can always put that in an appendix, and it's there as a reference if you need to go there.
Yeah. Well, I just think that guidance is so important because a lot of our sales interactions, right, always involve some kind of deck. They just do. There's always some kind of support deck. And the problem is that largely the sales profession has misused that vehicle because it becomes more of a catalog of stuff we can do versus a discussion guide. And so ideally you wouldn't use hardly any slides, but if you're going to use some, bring it from 50 down to 5 and make it mostly about the problem.
Yes. Well, we recommend that you do use slides or some kind of retellability document, which means that you don't want the customer to rely on taking their own notes. Because if you walk in and just have a conversation, you're now dependent upon the notes that they've taken. And those may or may not have captured the big ideas that you wanted them to. Right. Instead, you want to give them a form of their notes. And that's the purpose of the slide. Very different, as you described, from the way that most sellers will use the traditional PowerPoint decks, which is almost as either a reference or as a prompt for them to have discussions. So really critical to give them something. It could be paper or it could be slides, but you really want to equip them to retell your story in that decision maker's mind.
That's great. It's a storytelling asset that they can use to go share with people, but it's got to be pretty short and well laid out and sort of communicate that story. And I would imagine headlines and sound bites are really important here too, because you're branding how you're addressing the problem. One of the things that we promote is, even branding the problem and the initiative.
Oh my gosh.
That you're solving. If you can get involved in sort of naming
completely
the initiative with the client, then you can create momentum around getting it funded, takes on an identity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the first questions we ask or work with clients when we're working on developing a problem. It's name the problem, name it. Give it a name, give it a brand, as you say. That's best practice. When you can do that, now it's got handles in a way that somebody can carry it through to other meetings. It's like, well, our problem is, we've got a manual downtime or whatever it might be. But if you can name that problem, then you've really put some structure around it, really helped your customer remember it.
I really like that because one of the things I've always noticed, it's very clear. You look in the CRM system and you look at product selling versus solution sort of customer oriented selling, and the pipeline names are very different, right? You can immediately spot when you have a pipeline that's of high quality because it's in the customer's vernacular. Things are called initiatives, and they're usually wrap around what the customer is trying to address, and they've actually given it some identity. And when you capture that, people should think about, what am I calling these things in the first place? Because if you call it your product, its chances of being part of that story and being bought go way down.
Yeah.
But if you call it what they call it, and you fit it into their world, it goes way up. And that's my experience.
Agree. I think what gifted and experienced sellers have come to realize or learn is that oftentimes what we're selling is not what the customer is buying. And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. We were working with a client that was selling dental picks. So like oral, sort of like a replacement for floss. And they were caught up in selling the features and benefits. So it's easier to use and all of that. But then when we step back and we ask, okay, what are the problems of dental practices? And a number of problems. They talked about COVID mouth, people going away, patients not showing, not being able to come in for a long time. So when they came back, it took much longer to process them through teeth cleaning sessions, and they had more issues. And so that meant every patient was now taking more time. which meant that the number of patients they could see across a day was lower, which meant that they had to work longer. So you have dental hygienists burning out. You also had less revenue coming in because you were doing more work. And so if you didn't stretch it out, you were seeing fewer patients across a day. And so when we started to understand that or work with the client on that, they started to understand. So what we're actually selling is not a pick. What we're selling is a device that customers will use. It's easy to use. And so as a result of that, when they come in, they'll be in much better shape, which means for the practice, you'll need less time per patient and you can get back to the economics that you had before. So it's a dental pick was what they were selling, but what customers needed to buy was something that helped their practice, right? And so
Yeah,
that's
that's
a
a
great
great
example, I
example.
think, of this gap between what we're selling and what customers are buying. And that's why understanding the problem is so important, because then you simply frame the solution in terms of how it solves that problem. There's one additional point I'll make, and that's it's got to be differentiated. You have to really understand what about your solution or what you're offering, even your company, that is distinct, because otherwise you're just leading or dropping a trail of breadcrumbs that'll lead to your competitor store, and you don't want that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one final area I wanted to cover with you is sort of this idea of how you frame the value of the solution, the impact. So one of the things I've noticed is I don't think ROI as a sort of final ending. Your ROI is X, so if you spend this with me, you're going to get Y back. That's part of the story, but I think that there's a broader set of expectations. What the customer is really buying is business impacts in a future state that they really desire. Like they really need it, they really want it, they care about that future state. And there's a lot of elements to describing that. The story describes it, the path to get there, how
Yes.
easy or hard it is, how fast can I do it? Can I solve this sooner than later? But it's really that whole set of, I guess I would call it outcomes. It's almost like an outcome basket, but it's a set of things. And I think sometimes we as sellers think way too narrowly about just, here's an ROI, because I don't see people really react to that as well as they react to the overall story of impact
Yeah.
and future state. Share a little bit about your point of view on, what's the essence of the right way to frame
Yeah.
outcomes.
Well, where I'll start is with where the brain's decision centers are located, and that's near the emotional processing centers. All decisions inherently are subjective. And there's some fascinating research I don't have time to get into that proves that. But inherently, we're dealing with human beings, and human beings are going to make decisions based upon some subjective qualities. And so ROI can fit into that, but oftentimes it's more of a backfill, right? It's a backfill. It's like, we really want this and the ROI is good. Or as you're noting, there is a basket, or there could be a completely different set. And we look at the personal as well. Somebody who's buying your solution is putting their reputation on the line. Now, I think on the sales side, we think, man, it's so hard to sell to these big companies, for example. It's just impossible. But it's hard for people to buy. They have to jump through all the hoops. They have to do a lot of work, and they have to put their personal brands on the line a lot of times, right? Because they're tying themselves to you.
Right.
So if you don't acknowledge that in sales, you're missing a big part of the reasoning or the needs that your customer has in order to gain confidence in not just your solution, but your ability to help with the problem that you hopefully have brought up with them. So absolutely, if you just simply go through on the numbers, that's insufficient. Decision making is judgmental. People tend to use data as a backfill to the decision. And oftentimes those decisions have a very strong personal quality to it. It could be somebody, this is my chance to advance in the company. You're going to make a hero out of me, or you're going to make me look really good. And so if you don't really have a great sense of what those are, I would encourage you as a seller to make sure that you're asking some of those questions, because if you leave that out, your story is incomplete.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, in the couple minutes we have left, what are your final, we're coming up on 2026. We're talking to account teams of all kinds. What are your final thoughts on how to recommend to account team leaders how to sort of reshape the way that they're going to customer, is what I would say, to have these conversations, repeatable conversations over and over again, starting with the customer's problem.
Yep.
What would be sort of the takeaways you'd
Yeah,
sound like from
I'll
the
break
audience?
it into two broad buckets. One is we start off talking about message design, and then the meeting execution. So on the design side, simply simplify and storify. boil it down. I'll give you a rule of thumb. Boil your content down so that it takes no more than 1/3 of the total meeting time to get through. Let the architecture help you there. So in other words, if you have a 60-minute meeting, or most of your meetings with customers are 60 minutes, your sellers, or you, if you are a seller, should need or take no more than 20 minutes to get through the content. That's what we mean when we talk about simplify. We're talking about really boiling it down. And that leaves that other 2/3 of the time for you to ask questions, for you to have a discussion, to do discovery, to check, to see, what's resonating, what's not, to really drive home your big ideas. So that's the first part. The second part of it is storify it. So you want to organize it into, we call it a symphony of 3 movements. You have a problem, it's bigger than you realize. Second movement, we can solve that problem and we'll solve it better than anyone else. And then the third movement is, now let's look at what it would look like to work together and discuss next steps. So that's the story. That's the story arc. And if you think about it, all stories follow some version of that structure. If they don't, it's because they're consciously playing with it, right? Problem, solution, action, right? Next steps. So that would be the main 2 things on the design side. And then you have to execute. Right. So another problem we didn't really get into, but it's a huge problem, is nobody practices. And so people just sort of show up and wing it. And so there's a different version of the story every time. And it's not crisp. It doesn't come out the way you want. So the other part of that would be to make sure that your people are effectively coached on using the message in game day conditions. They need to practice in an environment that replicates the kind of questions and objections customers would ask, so that they get real, concrete, like situational practice around the use of that message in a conversation.
That's terrific. That's really great advice. And one of the things we're excited about together, Mark, is the combination of sort of these pre-intent signals,
Yes.
which are really becoming, companies are building signal-based strategies. They're trying to sort of accelerate that pipeline, work backwards from the customer and get a lot more at-bats that are really high quality. And the customer is the one spending the money. The customer has the problem to solve. The customer's able to shop on their own now. And so you really got to be good at this. So we're advocating together the combination of, pre-intent signals with great messaging.
Yes.
Be the first one in the room with a killer message. Practice, rehearse it, and get it down. And you will be amazed, I think, account teams, at how much progress you can make on filling that pipeline and closing more deals faster.
Yep.
With a higher success rate.
Completely agree with what you've said. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the problem is often the hardest thing in the story for our clients, for people to get right. And if you can find signals that are signaling a problem, right? Like a strategic goal or a gap or some big, whatever it might be. It could be an investor call. It could be, something that's picked up at a trade show, whatever it is, that signal is, there's a nut of a problem in that. Yeah. And all you need to do is just let that problem out, so to speak, put that in the form of that story. Yeah. And if you can do that in a reasonably quick way, so you've got timeliness, like you said, you have just now made a huge advance as a seller, as a sales leader. If you're now connecting what's happening at the customer to a problem they have that you're able to solve, and you're able to do that in a reasonably quick amount of time, that's pretty impressive. I think that's a real differentiator for go-to-market.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to add on to the tail end of this. Is you're as an account seller on an account, you need to become a master of the signals.
Yes.
Your account is projecting, not a master of the features and functions of your product.
Absolutely.
You got to flip it and really start to pay attention, because it works, and it works incredibly well. Bigger deals come out, but your customers will appreciate the fact that you're showing up about them in the first place.
Yes.
And if you keep it tight and it's rehearsed, you get a lot of rewards for that. And it's not just the one sale, right? This is repeatable at-bats. You get recommended to other parts of the organization. They know Absolutely. That you have their best interests. You're trained in their problems. Your approach will be very much appreciated. And we see that all the time. So
it's unlocking what I think the truly great sellers do, right? The ones who can understand what the customer needs and then provide them with that, and to do so effectively and efficiently, and under time pressure. You do that, and you're knocking it out of the park, right?
That's how you get off to a great 2020.
And if you can get a sales force to do that, and of course, you think about enterprise sellers, strategic accounts, that's really what they're paid to do.
Bread and butter.
They're really paid to do that, is to deliver the company, so to speak, to that customer the way the customer needs it. That's what we're really talking about.
Yeah.